Okay, we're going to continue along with the topic that we started yesterday and got in our practice debate, in which you will continue when you are going to do your actual lengthier debate for your assignment. But the first thing I want you to do is go to this ProCon website, https www.procon.org. That was it's a website that I was talking about yesterday that has arguments for and against a variety of ethical situations, one of which is euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. So I've got here some instructions for you to go through and explore that website. I will post these instructions as well. I'll post the PowerPoint without the audio so that you can have these instructions in writing. These are additional things that I want you to do. And then also in Plato, I've posted the couple of cases that we talked about. The Elizabeth Bouvier case, Larry McAfee, Brittany Maynard. And then after you read those three cases, I want you to think about what are the differences and similarities between the three cases. What factors are influenced? What factors influence the respective outcomes? What factors might have altered the outcomes? What might have made things different? And what role did the disability play in their outcomes? So just think about those. I may end up using that as the discussion post. Stay tuned. So we're going to talk for a little while about some historical or background perspectives on dying and dying well. And first, looking at Greece and Rome, because concepts and philosophy about death and dying goes way back in history. And if we go back to Greece and Rome, and don't panic, I'm not going too far back, or we're not going to spend too long here, but one of the things that was interesting back in that time is that they believed that it was the important thing was not to live, but to live well. It was all about living well. And they thought that, there were a lot of philosophers during that time, and they thought that the study of philosophy would give them wisdom about how to approach death. So that's part of what the philosophers were looking for, is how do we live a good life and die well. One of the things that's interesting is that they thought that they associated death with philosophy. So if you were interested in the study of death and dying, that made you a learned. And what they said was, they thought that, when you see someone who is distressed or anxious about dying, about the prospect of dying, it would provide evidence that he's a lover of the body and not a lover of wisdom. So death, in their view, should be embraced and should be studied and revered. Also, religious views. What's interesting is that the Bible doesn't specifically prohibit suicide, and even seems in some cases to condone some of the suicides that are within the Bible. And I'm not going to get into a long religious debate, but it wasn't until around the 4th century that Augustine condemned suicide, and he based that condemnation on the 6th commandment, thou shalt not kill, including he interpreted it as kill thyself. It wasn't until the 13th century when Thomas Aquinas held that suicide was sinful because it doesn't provide the person with any time to repent. And in his view, it was destroying a gift from God, and it deprived the community of talented people, deprived children of their parents, was unnatural. So he had a lot of these beliefs about the sinfulness of suicide. There have been a lot of philosophers who have talked about voluntary death. David Hume was an 18th century philosopher, and he wrote something called an essay on suicide, and he disagreed with Augustine, and he argued that voluntary death isn't a sin, that a house that falls by its own weight is not brought to ruin by God's providence. So he's saying that if God made the natural world through the laws of biology, medicine, etc., then disease belonged in that world as well. We remember Immanuel Kant. He was opposed to suicide, as you might imagine. He thought that it was an act, that an act is right if it's derived from a rule, and that the rule needs to be universalized, and suicide can't be universalized because the motive for suicide is self-interest. So if a person who doesn't respect his own life, even in principle, can't be restrained from even the most dreadful vices. So if you don't have respect for yourself, you don't have respect for laws, and you're going to succumb to vices. So that was Kant's view. There was another philosopher, John Stuart Mill, and he wrote an essay called On Liberty. And he believed that as long as nobody else is harmed, you can do whatever you want with your own bodies. He talked about things called self-regarding acts and other regarding acts. And suicide is a self-regarding act, and if you're not going to hurt anybody, then it's your business. Around the 20th century, there were, it's interesting because it was only the poor people without families who went to hospitals to die. So it's a little bit different in who is looking for assisted suicide more currently. Before World War II, most people died of things like sudden onset acute diseases like pneumonia, cholera, some of the other diseases that really couldn't be treated. But today, people are living longer, and living longer means that you are experiencing the longer presence of chronic diseases that weren't around earlier. So, we have chronic things like emphysema, diabetes, we have people getting dementias, cancers, heart disease. So all of these things that are chronic, and these diseases slowly erode away at a person's quality of life. And people want to die before that quality of life becomes too bad. That didn't happen prior to this because people were dying of more acute conditions like the pneumonia, like cholera, and other diseases that just didn't have any treatment. There was something called the Harrison Act of 1914, but prior to that, people could purchase heroin and opiates. And they used those drugs to lessen the pain of terminal cancer and other terminal diseases to die at home. So they didn't need to go to the hospital. But today, all of those drugs are controlled. So death, those kinds of death have become medicalized, and most people die in hospitals. We touched briefly on the topic of the Nazis and euthanasia, and this is an argument that people who are against physician-assisted suicide tend to add to the conversation. And they often refer to the German physicians during the Nazi era, when the physicians, in the name of euthanasia, killed 90,000 patients that they considered to have mental or physical, and I'm using quotes, inferiority. So these Nazi physicians administered what they called the final solution to the problem, which was to cleanse Germany of these racially, again, what they considered inferior non-Aryan people. And under this program, doctors killed 6 million Jewish people, 600,000 Polish people, thousands of gypsies, hundreds of gay men and lesbian women, all in the name of cleansing and using inferiority as their argument. In 1949, there was a doctor named Leo Alexander, and he argued that these Nazi killing programs began with the belief that some people are better off dead than alive because their quality of life is poor. Does that sound familiar? So the Nazis justified the killing of these people under the concept of their life is unworthy of life. And it started, this goes to the slippery slope argument that we talked about yesterday, and we're going to talk about more in a little bit. But they started with forced sterilization, and then they followed with the killing of what they considered to be impaired children in hospitals, and then impaired adults that were mostly from psychiatric hospitals, mental hospitals. Then they used carbon monoxide to kill, and you know how it kind of became that slippery slope where it progressed to more and more. So that's the argument that people who are against physician-assisted suicide say. But is it a slippery slope or not? The Germans, what's interesting is there was this belief of strongly supremacist belief even before all of this happened. So is it just something that was a natural progression to that point? What's different about all of this is that the German parents didn't consent to these killings. The officials took the babies and children out of the homes, and the parents never saw or heard from them again. So that makes it's a completely different argument. So those who use that argument to support against physician-assisted suicide, well, they're not consenting, and so the argument doesn't really bear weight. Also, the kind of to go along with the argument is in other ways that it's misleading. It had nothing to do with patients being competent. We're talking about patients who have the ability, have the autonomy to be able to go in and make those decisions for themselves. And in these cases, it had nothing to do with competent patients who were dying because these people had no choice. They weren't giving the option, and that goes to the second part. They didn't voluntarily request assistance in dying, and they didn't die good deaths. They died horrible deaths. So, it makes it a little bit more challenging to use that argument. Also, just throwing in here as another background perspective, hospice and the palliative care movement. And that really started in the U.S. about 1980. And the person who started that was a man named Derek Humphrey. And it was the Hemlock Society. And in the Hemlock Society, the mission was to help people with terminal illness die with dignity. And he also advocated the legalized physician-assisted dying. In the 60s, doctors Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and that name may be familiar with you, with regard to the stages of grief and dying. And she worked in Chicago, and another physician, Cicely Sanders, who was in Britain, they emphasized making terminal patients comfortable and began the hospice movement. And that the hospice movement gives dying patients dignity and control over their final months. Originally, these hospices were residences, but the concept evolved into visiting nurses treating the patients at home. Because of the work of these two physicians, doctors today are better able to relieve pain and better able to attend to the psychological needs of dying patients than they were previously. In the U.S., just interesting side note, Medicare pays for about 6 months of hospice care. It was around 1986 that the term palliative care became prevalent and actually began as a medical specialty. So palliative care provides just comfort for dying patients. It relieves nausea, it's suffocation, immobility, depression, and pain. So it doesn't use any experimental treatment, but focuses on those areas.